the initial presentations today will first come from Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the founder of the Schiller Institute and probably one of the most significant figures today on the planet, though she may find that a little excessive. I would find it very true, given where the world is now developing, especially in China with the New Silk Road or One Belt, One Road perspective, and her efforts there since going back really since the 1960s, but especially over the last couple of decades. Following Mrs. LaRouche, we will have then the Consul General of the Russian Federation for San Francisco, Mr. Sergei Petrov. He will be speaking regarding Russia's policies and development programs more generally. We will take questions from Mrs. LaRouche after her presentation. We will then take questions from Mr. Petrov after his. And then following that, we will have Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, who probably needs no introduction, who will then have a 45-minute dialogue with him, which is something that we often do in Manhattan every Saturday, but will be a unique opportunity for people here to have a dialogue with him. So that's the basic outlay for the morning. We will have this afternoon, again, somewhat remarkable speaker, Senator Mike Gravel, famous for the Pentagon Papers, here with us today. Dr. Howard Chang, a leading expert on water development projects, and Keisha Rogers on the questions of space exploration and the mission for mankind. So I would hope everyone can stay. Following lunch, we will have a musical introduction, a cello sonata by a local cellist, Andres Vera. So again, so that's the basic outline for the day. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, speaking to us live via video. And after her presentation and initial remarks, we will then have a dialogue session with her. So please enjoy. Helga.
Implication of the release of the 28 pages from a strategic standpoint, and certainly the solution to all of these problems, the new Silk Road as a global development perspective, and the idea how easy it would be to escape all of these dangers. But I think that if you look at the world situation, especially the American public, who almost knows nothing about it. People in Europe know a little bit more, but if you compare the immediate danger of an escalation of a confrontation between NATO, United States, Great Britain, and Russia and China on the other side, then the knowledge about it is so little that for me this is actually the most scary aspect, because the absence of a public debate about the possible extinction of the whole civilization, may it be because of the indifference of many people because they just don't care, or may it be that they're too scared to think it through, but the lack of a public debate is what we have to change. So therefore, what I'm going to say is not only meant to be food for thought, and I really want you to think about it, but it's also supposed to be food for action. Now let me start with the first immediate situation, that is the war danger. Since about 2 days, maneuvers have started in the Baltics, in Poland, where you have a rather remarkable combination of four NATO exercises. The most prominent is called Anaconda 2016. 30 soldiers from 24 nations, 14,000 Americans, 12,000 Poles, 1,130 parachute drops, a crossing of the Vistula River, the exercise of a nighttime assault, 35 helicopters, 3,000 vehicles, Navy ships. And together with the other three in the Baltic ones, in Poland, so all of Altogether, these are more than 60,000 troops in a maneuver right now at the border of Russia. And I can tell you, it's the first time since Hitler and his Operation Barbarossa where that amount of troops are amassing at the Soviet border, but it's the first time since the beginning of the 40s that this has occurred. Now, obviously, when you have these many troops in exercises rehearsing the non-existing threat of Russia attacking the Baltics, then the danger naturally is that some accident could happen and you could have, you know, an escalation, because the warning time is a couple of minutes, that you could have a deterioration of the situation into a large war. Now, The Guardian, this is a British newspaper, quoted an unnamed European defense attaché saying this is a nightmare scenario because a mishap could lead to the great disaster. I wouldn't call it the danger of a mishap. I would say it's the largest provocation determined really to, you know, cause Russia to capitulate. But will they capitulate? Obviously not, because just a couple of weeks ago in Romania there was the installation of the ballistic missile defense system, which many Russian experts have said to take capability of the Russian nuclear arsenal. Now, already 2 years ago, there were at a conference in Moscow video animations shown which showed that the entire ballistic missile system, which has been continued to be built by Obama, has only one aim, and that is to prepare a first strike on Russia. By taking out the second strike, Russia also said they cannot and will not accept that this ballistic missile system is being built beyond a certain point, because when Russia becomes undefensible, obviously then it would be too late. Now, the whole ballistic missile defense system supposedly was directed against Iranian missiles. But first of all, everybody knew from the beginning that that was a lie. Russia offered many times to have such installations in the south of Russia, which the United States refused. And the latest, since the P5+1 agreement with Iran, such a threat does not exist anymore. And furthermore, Putin has requested many times from Obama that the threat which Russia feels from this ballistic missile system should be discussed. And Obama has flatly refused to even discuss it. So there are now articles appearing which correctly make the point that there is only one explanation why such a refusal to discuss it would be the case, and that is indeed that the United States is preparing a surprise attack on Russia. Now, normally you would say this is crazy, this cannot be, because if you use nuclear weapons, even if people have forgotten the stark lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that President Kennedy at that time had said, you know, if it comes to a nuclear war, those people who will die in the first hours will be happy as compared to those who die a couple of weeks later, or who die as a consequence of the nuclear winter, because they will die a much more miserable death. Well, that lesson has been forgotten. People have not paid attention to it, but in reality, the NATO doctrine has changed since the times of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and since such a strategic confrontation with the medium-range missile crisis in the 80s, when the SS-20 and the Pershing II were directed against each other with only a few minutes warning time. At that time, you had hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in Europe warning comes to nuclear war, then that will be the end of human civilization. Today, experts at the side of the cubists who have that the situation is much variety of reasons. One reason is that the mutual assured destruction doctrine, which was the idea that not one side can use nuclear weapons because it will lead to the annihilation of everybody, that idea of a mutual assured destruction has been replaced by a utopian conception that with modern smarter weapons, you can actually win a nuclear war. Now, President Obama, when he took office, promised he would try to go into a nuclear-free world. He got the Peace Nobel Prize for that. Now, if you look at it, he has just recently committed the United States to spend to modernize all nuclear arsenals, including tactical nuclear weapons installed mostly in Europe, the so-called B-62 12 bombs, which are supposed to be put on stealth bombers and then sort of sneak through the air defense of the opponent, in this case naturally Russia, be more usable, take out the target, and that way disarm. Now recently there were hearings in the US Senate, and Senator Feinstein commented on that and said the very idea of having new modernized nuclear weapons which are supposedly, quote, more usable is already an utterly immoral idea. Now, it will not function like that. Right now, in the situation where beginning of July in Warsaw, where 4 battalions to the Russian border in the Baltics, they want to beef up the equipment, move heavy armament into Poland, into the Baltic states, and arm the Ukrainian forces deployed against the eastern Ukraine. They want to link up the Romanian ballistic missile system with the Aegis destroyer warships in the Baltics, in the Black Sea, and all of this has reached a point of utmost provocation. But one should be very clear, and that has also been expressed by many military experts. With all of this big moving of troops into Poland, into Estonia, Lithuania, what does it all amount to? Nothing. Because if it would come, these conventional forces would be overrun by the Russian army in no time. And there is a general agreement among military experts that they therefore only constitute a so-called tripwire condition, namely being the pretext where some kind of an incident then creates the precondition for war. Now, if it comes to war, and that has been stressed just today in a comment by the Russian ambassador in Denmark, where somebody asked him, who said, yeah, obviously Russia will make a fierce response to these maneuvers. And the Russian ambassador to Denmark said, no, we will not dramatize these maneuvers. We will just keep a very sharp eye. And people should just be aware that if it comes to war, it will be a general war, which nobody can want. Now, Russia is obviously reacting to it. They're having their own military measures. They're putting more troops into the various bases in the northern military district. They are making their own maneuvers, against the intrusion of Aegis destroyer ships in the Black Sea, exercising pilots taking out these Aegis ships, which are part of the system. But this all shows you how extremely dangerous this is. And we are sitting on top of an immediate war danger right now, and the people in the United States do not even know about it. Now, unfortunately, this is not the only spot of potential war danger. The other one is related to China, because the confrontation against China is exactly of the same nature like that against Russia. One of those is the South China Sea. Now, when you listen to the Western media, you will hear that it's the aggressive land grabbing of China in some of these islands in the China Sea. Most of them are just rocks, but in reality, it's nothing of that sort. China is obviously, and if you look at the map, the South China Sea islands are all in the relative vicinity of China, and since the 9th century are regarded to be Chinese territory. China has expressed that by the so-called 9-dash line, showing historical claims are. And in the recent period, the United States started to make the point that China is fortifying some of these islands, building land strips, which China is doing, but so have all the other countries done. Vietnam, the Philippines have all done the same thing. And it's clearly designed to create a similar provocation. Now, the Philippine government, still under the old government, went to Den Haag, to the International Arbitration Court, and said that these claims are not legitimate, and basically, it's expected that the Den Haag court soon in September will come out with a ruling saying no, China is not. Now, people have to understand that there are legislations. For example, there is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the so-called UNCLOS law, and of the parties in the South China Sea, DOC, which have been signed by all Anrainer countries from this region, that nobody would seek unilateral arbitration, but that every dispute, territorial controversy, would be negotiated on a bilateral level through negotiation and diplomacy. And therefore, China has taken the position that the effort to take this to an international court, which is not recognized by China, is actually a violation of international law. Now, there is already in the last several weeks, including, I think, yesterday, there were many violations of the 12-mile zone by US warships or overflights of these islands by US fighter jets. And it is very clear that, at a certain moment, China may assert its right to put up an air defense system, an ADIC system. And at that point, we are probably looking at a showdown of, the potential that it gets out of control. Okay, now let's take a step back. What is this all about? Why are we at several spots in the world? At the Russian border in Eastern Europe, at the South China Sea, around South and North Korea, with the threat of the United States to implement or to station the THAAD missiles which go very far into the territory of Russia and China and are not just aimed against North Korea. Then naturally the whole situation in Southwest Asia, which is still a complete powder keg, despite the fact that the situation in Syria has been stabilized by President Putin's intervention. Why are we at the verge of World War III? What is it? What is this issue? Well, it all comes back to what happened when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. As recent historians make clear without a question of doubt, there were promises given to Gorbachev, to Chancellor Kohl, to Genscher, and to others that if Germany would be allowed to unify and be part of NATO, then NATO would absolutely not expand to the borders of Russia. Now, recent archive materials have documented that what has been said by the former US Ambassador Matlock and others, that these promises were given and that was part of how the Cold War, but that at the same time, Secretary of State Baker already made moves to do exactly the opposite, namely to move NATO troops closer to the border, to win over more members of the former Warsaw Pact to join NATO. And as Victoria Nuland has publicly stated, the State Department altogether spent, alone in the case of Ukraine, $5 billion for regime change, for color revolution, and all of this was an attempt to encircle Russia with the idea to finally cause regime change in Russia and, by the same logic also in China. Now, the logic behind that is that at the moment when the Soviet Union disintegrated, there would have been the unique chance to have a peace order for the 21st century. Because the enemy was gone, communism had disintegrated, and why not establish a peace order which would have, created a basis for the ending of war, of having a peaceful cooperation, of finally attending those issues which are in the common interest of all of mankind. Now, we from the LaRouche movement and the Schiller Institute, we proposed exactly that. We proposed first the Eurasian land bridge, New Silk Road, and we kept pushing this idea to unite Europe and Asia through development corridors as the basis for a peace order, and we always invited the United States to be part of that. Unfortunately, you had at that time the neocons in the United States, and the neocons already in '97 had developed this idea of a project for a new American century, the PNAC problem, which was the idea that, okay, the Soviet Union, the enemy, and now is the time to have a unipolar world and to go for regime change against anybody who would not submit to this order. To have the idea that the United States, together with Great Britain, based on the special relationship with the British, would have an empire and would not allow one nation or a group of nations to ever become economically, politically, or militarily as strong as the United States, bypass the United States, and therefore regime change, color revolution, or military intervention, as we have seen it in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, would be legitimate. Now, obviously, this is an illusion because the unipolar world has long ceased to exist. Asia is rising, bypassing the United States. They are already exporting more high technology goods. They are already producing more high technology scientists, engineers than the United States. Their economic growth rate has been, even if it went down from 12% in the coastal areas, 10% generally, to only about 7%. Well, it's still a significant growth. India is even bigger. They have 8%. China and India together have 2.5 billion people. Then 1/3 of all people are Indians or Chinese. And in a certain sense, since China has launched the New Silk Road initiative, 70 countries have joined this kind of economic cooperation, and it is expected that by the end of the year, it will be 100 nations working on a win-win cooperation with China, with Russia, with India. And, therefore, the idea to maintain a unipolar world by military domination, by drawing people into military alliances for the confrontation against Russia and China is simply a no-win perspective. And that was just very, very clear at the recent Shangri-La Defense or Security Conference in Singapore, where the US Defense Secretary Ash Carter tried to impose a NATO-like structure for Asia, but it did not go over so hot because Japan is now moving more with Russia. The Vietnamese invited Chinese military maneuvers. So it didn't go over so well because many countries realized that they have the choice right now between either joining World War III on the side of the United States or keep going into a cooperation with the BRICS countries, with the Asia-centered Silk Road. And therefore, the idea that it's possible to maintain a unipolar world simply will not succeed. Now, however, how do we get out of this? How do we get the United States to recognize that it is not in their best interest to do this? Because eventually, if it comes to a global war, it will lead to the destruction of all of mankind. Now, given the present combination of governments from the Bush administration to Obama, I don't think that an appeal to pure reason is not going to work. Therefore, I want to focus on the significance of the 28 pages. Now, most of you are aware of what the subject is. For those who are watching and listening, let me just very briefly summarize it again. The 9/11 attack occurred, then there was a congressional investigation of both houses, the Congress and the Senate, headed by Senator Bob Graham. They published an official report. Of this report, 28 pages were classified. And President Obama, in his election campaign, had promised the families of the 3,000 victims of the World Trade Center, he would publish it because these people have the right to know why their relatives died. Now, in the meantime, a whole movement has been created for the release of these 28 pages, because those who have read them, and some of the congressmen have read them because they were allowed to go read it but not talk about it because they're still classified, and a lot of information has come out in various forms since, which make very, very clear that what these 28 pages signify is the role of Saudi Arabia in the financing of the September 11 attack. The complicity, naturally comes then the question who in the United States was complicit in the cover-up. Everything points to the role of the FBI, among others. Now, recently the Congress, or rather the Senate, passed a bill, the so-called Justa bill, allowing civil suits against Saudi Arabia to go ahead in this context. Now, why is this so important? Now, just take it a step back. What was September 11 doing? It not only changed the Constitution in the United States, it eliminated many, many civil liberties. It allowed the limitless surveillance of not only American citizens, but citizens around the world through the NSA. But in terms of foreign policy, it not only gave the war against Afghanistan, but it was the pretext for the war against Saddam Hussein, the famous so-called weapons of mass destruction, which never existed, the war against Gaddafi, the attempt to topple Assad, the total destruction of the Middle East and Northern Africa, and naturally, and that has to be stated very clearly, Europe right now is completely destabilized to the point of the detonation of the European Union through an unprecedented refugee crisis, or rather a refugee crisis which the last time there was something like that was at the end of World War II, when millions of people marched as a consequence of the Second World War. And now you have millions on the march from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, trying to get into Europe. And Europe is falling apart as a consequence of that, and nobody dares to talk about the so-called root causes of this refugee crisis. But the root causes are wars based on lies, based on the lies of September 11. So therefore, if this document would be published, and now the demand is not only to publish that, but also the 80,000 documents withheld by the FBI, which were never given to the September 11 Commission, then naturally the whole policy would have to be reviewed, and Internet would have to return. The role of Saudi Arabia in financing ISIS, al-Nusra, the continuous supply of ISIS by Turkey, so all of this would come out, and maybe it would cause a big upheaval, but that upheaval is absolutely necessary to stop this present cause War 3. So therefore, about this in the afternoon session, because he was the courageous person introducing the Pentagon Papers into the Senate at the time. But I'm appealing to you that one of the very clear leverages you American citizens have to intervene is the publication of these 28 pages, which by no means are just a single issue, the question who did September 11, but given the fact that already the German media and many media in Europe, but especially the German media, there was a primetime TV program in a program called Monitor, where they said 28 pages come out. The entire history of 9/11 has been rewritten. Getting one of the keys, the strategic situation, 1 second before 12, I hope. Okay, now let me introduce the third subject. The solution to all of this would be a piece of cake. It is already there. Now, a new Silk Road disintegrated. We called it at that time first the productive triangle. 91, we called it the Eurasian land bridge, the new Silk Road, which was the idea to, when the Iron Curtain had fallen, the population and industrial centers of Europe with those of Asia through development corridors. Program would have changed the world in the direction of a peace order already in 91, but unfortunately you had Bush Senior, you had Margaret Thatcher, you had François Mitterrand, who all had completely different ideas. They were Russia from a superpower into a third world raw material producing country, and they imposed the shock therapy in the Yeltsin period. They dismantled the Russian potential in 3 years before, and they had no intention to allow Germany to have any kind of economic relation with Russia. So it did not happen. You had the 90s, which were genocide against Russia. You had all of the consequences of the Bush period. You had, the 8 years of Clinton, which was a certain interruption, but then with Bush Jr. and Obama, you went back to the old project of an American century doctrine and the idea of a unilateral world. But fortunately, in 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road to be the strategic objective of China. And in the 2 years, or almost 3 years, which have passed since, this idea to end geopolitics, to establish in the tradition of the ancient Silk Road a win-win cooperation among all nations on the planet, is progressing extremely quickly. Now remember that the ancient Silk Road was a fantastic cooperation in terms of exchange of culture, goods, paper, technology, porcelain, silk producing, other cultural manifestation, and it led to a tremendous benefit for all the countries which have participated from Asia to Europe. Now, the new Silk Road obviously is doing exactly that. The amount of projects which have been concluded between China and ASEAN countries, China and Latin American countries, China and Europe, China and African countries, China and East European countries, and now in a very clear fashion, the economic integration between the Eurasian Economic Union headed by Russia and the new Silk Road is progressing very lines has been formed between Russia and China, with India being a third factor in the situation, and many other countries have been joining. Now, contrary to what you read and hear in the mass media, China is not doing badly. They are shifting their economic orientation from an export orientation, because the export market in the transatlantic sector are shrinking. They are now going more in infrastructure investment in many countries in the world, and to develop the inner region of China, consumer higher standard of their own population, since they have lifted 600 million people out of poverty, a very decent living standard in China. This is indeed the absolute correct policy to say we will uplift the remaining people who are still poor and also make them participate in the Chinese economic miracle. Now, Xi Jinping has to President Obama that the United States, not only by helping to reach, I think is the moral obligation of the United States, given the fact that they were the key reason why these countries are now in such disarray, by participating in the building of Africa, which I think the West has an absolute moral obligation, because the reason why you have millions of people as refugees not only risking their life, drowning in the Mediterranean, dying in the Sahara, which has even more victims than even the Mediterranean, because 50 years of IMF policy has denied economic development to Africa. And the reason why people are risking 50%, taking a risk 50% chance to cross the Mediterranean, is because they run away from war, from hunger, from epidemics. And this is the result of Western policy denying this continent economic development. So we have a moral obligation to join hands to develop Southwest Asia, to develop Africa. Now, the United States also needs a Silk Road. If you look at the figures of the US Labor Statistics Office of the productivity, which has collapsed since 7 years in a row, all the indexes are going down. The United States population is in a terrible condition, or at least the poorer parts, while the rich become more rich and Wall Street is having a heyday with cocaine parties and plotting destruction for the rest of the world. But the United States needs an infrastructure project. The roads are bad. The traffic is ridiculous. People spend hours and hours every day in commuter trading, risking to disappear with their car in potholes. They have no train. China has built 20,000 kilometers fast train systems until the end of last year. They plan to have 50,000 kilometers until the year 2020, uniting every major city in China through a fast train system, which are fantastic. They're smooth, they're fast, they're quiet. How many fast train kilometers or miles has the United States built? 0. So for the United States to build an own Silk Road to connect with a global development perspective is a question of the best self-interest. And we have to get the United States off this confrontation course and simply say, you know, we have to shift our policy, and all this $1 trillion invested in modernization of nuclear arsenals and the largest military budget in the world, trying to maintain an empire which is collapsing anyway, rather shift, get rid of Wall Street, impose Glass-Steagall, go back to a policy of Alexander Hamilton, a credit policy, invest in infrastructure, and go in the direction of a win-win cooperation with the other nations of the world, with Russia, China, European nations, India, build up Latin America, build up Africa and Southwest Asia. So this is really the choice in front of the United States. And I know that, you know, it's very difficult for you to think how this should be done, but, you know, I mean, think about Kennedy, think about the kind of optimistic country the United States used to be. Think about the idea that America was built to be a beacon of hope and a temple of liberty where people from the whole world would go and try to be free. You were singing the national anthem, the land of the free. Is the United States the land of the free today? I don't think anybody who is in their right mind would say that today. So, you know, go back to the values of the American Republic as it was founded by people like Benjamin Franklin or George Washington. Go back to the policies of Alexander Hamilton, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Kennedy, Martin Luther King. And I think that if the United States could mobilize itself to be back that nation, the whole world would love to be friends of the United States again. Right now, I can tell you, the rest of the world has almost given up on the United States. And when they look at the election process, the choice between a very, very irrational Trump and unfortunately a very, very predictable Hillary Clinton, given her statements about confrontation against Russia and China, I think you have to really mobilize now. And I think the 28 pages, Glass-Steagall, these are flanks which can derail the situation long before this election is going to take place. So we have to have a completely new world. I mean, in a certain sense, remember, mankind is not a beast. And mankind is not, you know, bound to do what seems to be inevitable, but mankind is the only species capable of reason, capable of free will, of defining and designing a beautiful future, and then go and implement that which, you know, was the last time with Kennedy, the Apollo project, and, you know, I think we can absolutely do it again. So I think you have a great possibility in front of you, and I would encourage you, be American, be true Americans again, and the whole world will be the most happy and embrace you.
Thank you, Helga. I think Helga demonstrates that it should be the most fun to solve the world's biggest problems. This is not a burden, but something that we should look forward to accomplishing and enjoy the process. So in that light, I would ask people to come up and ask a question. We have a question mic here. And so if people have, it's not amped, but yep, it should be turned on. Good? Okay. So if people have questions, it's an open dialogue with Mrs. LaRouche. I would ask that people have questions on the topic of the discussion today. You might have a lot of other things you're thinking about, but we'd like to have a thorough dialogue regarding the subjects that she's taken up. And I would also ask that you make your questions somewhat curt and to the point, because we'd all like to hear what she has to say and hear a dialogue back and forth. So please go ahead.
Hi, Helga. Thank you for your presentation. And my question is, I thought that the 28 pages were leaked already, and Der Spiegel already published them I don't know how many years ago this was, 10 years ago or something like that. And I just wondered if you had knew about that, or if anybody in this room actually knows about that too. The 28 pages, I mean, maybe they were redacted when they were leaked, but I thought they were just, leaked as a big, a chapter.
Well, I'm not aware of this publication, what you just said. I mean, I can, if Mike Steger or somebody knows about it, please say so. But my best knowledge is there is a huge fight in the Congress right now, in the Senate, to release these. I know that the Congressman Walter Jones, for example, either has already introduced a law in the Congress which would allow the Congress to immediately release it, given the fact that there is an existing legislation which allows the Congress to publish everything they really want. There is nothing preventing them. And there is a huge battle, because the only thing which prevented the publication was pressure from the White House and the Department of Justice, always saying, either poo-pooing the content of the 28 pages or saying it would cause irreparable damage in the foreign relations of the United States. There was even a complete freak-out article in the Daily Telegraph a couple of days ago warning against the publication with the argument that it would damage the interests of the British because, people would then use that to sue Great Britain for harboring terrorism or not moving aggressively against hate preachers. So I don't think, if these 28 pages would be public, all of this commotion would not take place. So my best understanding is that we are now in the crucial battle to release them. If you know of the 28 pages, tell us, but frankly, I doubt it very much, because the entire Congress and the Senate and all these families, everybody is in motion, and they would not do that if the 28 pages would already be in the public domain.
They haven't been released. And the tragedy is that there's about 40 co-sponsors right now. Is this coming across?
You're good.
There's about 40 co-sponsors right now for the law to asking permission of the executive to release them. In point of fact, this is all very ridiculous and silly, because what was decided by the Supreme Court in my case in 1972 was that any member of Congress, any member, could release any information, secret or top secret or cosmic or whatever, if they thought that this was in the best interest of the United States. And so we don't need a law. We don't need permission of the executive. Any one member, and there's 40 of them that say they want to release this, but they don't have the guts to do it, unfortunately. And you're quite right. The release of the papers would affect our foreign policy with respect to Saudi Arabia, which would be a blessing, because that foreign policy is an embarrassment and a stain on the attitude, the views that you have, Helga, towards our supposed support of freedom. So, Helga, the pages will be released. It's a question of not how, but when.
Senator Mike Gravel, everyone.
Good morning, Helga. This is Ned Nergi from Oakland. You earlier spoke of PNAC, the New American Century. And I've been thinking about that over the last several weeks. I've known about it for several years, but I've just had a new thought, and I want you to respond to my thought as to what your thoughts are on it. I wonder what the American population would do if they actually recognized that PNAC's policies, as you've described them here, a unipolar world, was exactly the thinking of the British Empire in 1776 regarding their wayward colonies.
Well, I think it would probably help. You know, I mean, if people would, well, in a certain sense, you know, recognize how the American Revolution was, because you know the British, as you know, almost went crazy about the loss of the American colony. George the First went literally, he lost his marbles, he went insane, and the British already American Revolution. They tried to do this first by military means in the War of 1812. Then, you know, they tried to do it with the Civil War against Lincoln, where the Confederacy was allied with, and then they realized that it would be impossible to reconquer the United States by military means. So then latest, with the assassination of President McKinley and the ascension of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, they basically, you know, decided that, you know, the best way to do would be to subvert the American establishment. You had the kindergarten or the Coop and the Fabian Society and various efforts to lure the American establishment into a discussion process by basically convincing them that the United States should adopt the foreign policy model of the British Empire and then rule the world based on the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States as a world empire. Now, all the present policy elite with that doctrine. And that is actually, you know, people like Samuel Huntington, Kissinger, Brzezinski, all of these people have been basically, you know, they have been educated so therefore, you know, in a certain sense, you know, it's a very big challenge. You are absolutely right. The idea of empire, you know, the idea of the British Empire as it was when the American Revolution was made against it, in essence, is exactly what the unipolar world is today. I fully agree with that. It requires that the Americans really recognize how their own history has been subverted. And, you know, my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has made a big effort to, you know, educate people on which presidents are patrioting the ideals of the American Revolution and which ones were traitors. And, you know, the problem is whenever you have an Anglophile president, you're really dealing with a traitor betraying the ideals of the American Revolution. But, you know, I think it's really up to you to help to educate the American population to realize exactly that and become red-blooded Americans again instead of poor imitations of blue-blooded British.
I came up in one of our LaRouche meetings that the people that are, I guess what you call the soldiers of the anarchy and the momentum for war and the fascism here, that they're, you know, not necessarily all evil. That there are certain ones that have a bad taste in their mouth about what's happening, and that's kind of, you know, possibly where we could, you know, get a flank or something like that. And I thought you know, could comment on that, on what sort of avenues we could use. Well, not necessarily military could be a big part of it, yeah. But people that are, say, in government that are implementing these policies and policy makers that, you know, they have a bad taste about the momentum and the war and the fascism. And, you know, these would be like officials, any kind of officials, you know, what sort of people like that do you think we could use as a blank?
Well, I think that the situation in the United States is not totally different from that in Europe, insofar as you have people who, just feel completely comfortable with the system, and they, have an amazing ability to block out whatever would disturb the privileges which they get from being part of the system, even if the system is becoming fascist, genocidal, and all of these things. So these people normally are to talk to, because you say, because if they even listen to you, then that may lead to that they are no longer participants in the club of privileges. Now, my experience both in the United States and in Europe is that those people who are not localist, who are not chauvinist, who are not people just looking at their immediate situation, but are traveling, who have contact to other countries, they are normally much, much, much more aware that there is a completely different view outside of the United States or outside of Europe of them. For example, I participated in a big conference in India in March, where the first panel was on the refugee crisis in Europe. And I was really, in a certain sense, shocked to see how the reputation of Europe has gone down for their inability to provide a human answer to this refugee crisis. People said, people from Asia and Africa, they said, the Europeans should stop talking about human rights or democracy. Look at what they're doing. They're shooting with military means against these refugees. They're putting them in camps, which can't call it. There is no human rights anymore in Europe. So, it always helps to have a view almost, from outside our own shoulder. So therefore, I think the people who are of ethnic background in the United States, either Chinese American, other Asian American, Russian American, European American, ethnic Americans, or people who have done business in China or who have gone to Russia, those people normally have a much better view, and they are aware of the fact that the outside world looks at the United States with horror right now. Then I think what is extremely important also is not only to confront people with the negative, but I think it is very, very important to show people a beautiful vision where the United States could be as part of a new paradigm in the world in a couple of years from now, in 50 years from now, in 100 years from now. Joint space research, international cooperation for fusion power, to discover the laws of the universe in a deeper and better way, reviving classical culture in the United States. I think it is as important to confront the negative as it is important to have a beautiful vision of the United States as it should be again. Because if people don't have hope and people don't have a perspective for the future, normally they have a very difficult time, to mobilize the courage to do something. And right now you have so many people in the United States who commit suicide, who are desperate, who don't see a future. The youth culture is a horror show. So I think it is very important to find the thinking people, especially of ethnic Americans, and basically show them the potential of what it would mean to join hands with other countries to build a world which would be, worth the name of being human.
Helga, my name is Ken Smith. I'm from Sunnyvale, California, in Silicon Valley. And the question I have is how do we deal with the fear that I feel that exists in our culture about really having the courage to speak out about the kinds of things that you're discussing. I think we really down deep, I think all of us truly want peace in the world. And yet we feel that those of us who speak out against, if you will, the club, you mentioned the club earlier, we seem to get chastised and labeled as radicals. I happen to be tending to be on the right side of the political world, and when I attend LaRouche events, I'm chastised by some of my colleagues who say, "What in the hell are you doing?" You know, and how do we deal with that?
I think it's the question of can you look into the mirror in the morning when you what is more important? Is it more important to be accepted by your stupid neighbors and colleagues when they are thinking stupid? Or is it more important that you are truthful, that you uphold principles which are, the important principles of the universe and of mankind? I think it's very important that you make a decision. Do you want to be a shallow-minded opportunist going with public opinion just to be in the flow, or do you want a person? And I think that the only people who are worth anything are those people who are looking for the truth, no matter if it's science, culture, or political truth. And I always tell people, if you think through where we are at, it's okay to have fear, but fear is actually a good thing. If children wouldn't have fear, and some children have to be taught to what are the dangers, because they would jump out of the window, they would put their hand on the oven, they would take matches and burn down the house, because they don't have yet a sense of the real danger. So fear per se is not a bad thing. Fear is actually something which is part of the survival instinct. Without fear, you cannot survive. But fear has to be located to the right thing and not an irrational fear. Of the stupid opinion of your neighbor is really nothing compared to the fear about the possibility of the annihilation of mankind in a nuclear war, or for that matter in a financial system breaking down in chaos, because we are equally close to a collapse of the transatlantic financial system, which, if it would happen, would lead to a chaos, and out of the chaos would come for sure also war. So, if you think about what could happen with these maneuvers, with this confrontation policy towards Russia and China, you could have a situation where nuclear war happens. And what would that mean? Have you ever thought about what that would mean? It would mean that everything you did, your family, your ancestors, all the great minds of the past, of Abraham Lincoln, of Beethoven, of Einstein, all of this would have been for nothing, because there would be absolutely nobody to even remember that that they existed. There would be no museum to keep the record. It would all vanish. Now, for me, that is a real fear, because I think that mankind has produced so many beautiful things, like the great classical compositions or the great dramas, all the many beautiful cultures which have developed around the world. I think that is the fear you should have, really. And in a certain sense, you must become free. The inner self has to become free. And Friedrich Schiller has developed this conception in two very beautiful writings of his, which were called, or are called, About the Sublime. And there he describes this. He says, when man is only a physical beast, a physical creature, well, then fear can take over very easily, because even a bear is more strong. A tiger can eat up, And therefore, as long as you are only a physical person, fear is dominating you. But man is not just, that. Man has the ability to connect his or her identity to universal principles which are more immortal than your physical existence and are of a higher value than you as a person. Now, Schiller says if you do that and you locate your identity in the universal history of all of mankind or other great principles, then you may not be physically safe because a lion can still eat you for breakfast, but your inner person is free. You are morally free. And then you are not afraid of things which you should not be afraid of. And I think the whole struggle of all of us is to continuously work on this idea of the inner freedom, because if you don't think, you can be intimidated, and then you are nothing but a slave. And I think that is a condition which we all should absolutely abhor and reject as not being in cohesion with the human dignity. So, be courageous and develop your inner freedom, and then you will be funny and laugh about your stupid neighbors and be ironic, make polemics, and then very, very soon they will realize that you are the wise man and they are the children who have to learn from you.
Hello. I have noticed that over the past year or two, there has been so much published, like either through emails or through different publications, about people like Hillary admitting that the United States created and supports ISIS. There are just so many things that are coming out now that that we've known about for a long time, but they're coming out publicly, which I find surprising, but I'm very happy about. And I'd like to know, do you see this, or does this in any way indicate that maybe that since more information is coming out, that more people will begin to realize what's going on and make their feelings known about these things? Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. I think there is all reason for optimism, because this genie was and it is out. As I said, when you have primetime German TV talking about that the history of September 11 has to be rewritten, and then they published a 45-minute interview with Senator Bob Graham, who, by the way, already when the terrorist attack against the French satire magazine Charlie Hebdo happened more than a year ago, Senator Bob Graham said if the 28 pages would have been published, this terrorism would not have happened. And the fact that now you have more terrorism in France, but also in Belgium, there are terrorist alerts out in Germany. I think that the motivation to get to the ground of this and stop this terrorism is growing by the day. So I think that, the old statement by Lincoln, you can fool all people sometimes, some people all the time, but not all people all the time, is now really coming true. And I think that if the truth about September 11th would really come out in a big time, and we are very close to that, it would lead to what the Greeks would call a catharsis. Because it would not just lead to the question of why the cover-up, why the cover-up of the Bushes, why the administration, but it would lead to a catharsis of why all of this evil was condoned. And it would lead to a shake-up for sure. That's why the pressure is so big to prevent it from happening. But we need a complete clean-up of all of these rotten policies. So I think we can be absolutely optimistic that if we do the right thing and if we mobilize now for the whole package, don't focus on a single issue, but focus on the whole package, the 28 pages, what happened September 11, the war danger, what to do against it, the need to straighten out the financial system with Glass-Steagall, the whole package what Lynn has described with the 4 principles, join hands with the new Silk Road, with Russia, China. I think there is a way out. And you know, if as long as people don't become small-minded and only look at one single issue, but as long as you really look at it from the top, you all thinkers, you know, think as if you would be the President of the United States and as if it would be depending on you to bring the world back in order. And if you have that demand on yourself, you will see that you will have increasing powers which enable you to do things you have not been thinking you would ever be capable of doing. And if many, many citizens are doing that, the majority of citizens are doing that, then you are a republic again.
So Helga, I think that's the end of our dialogue, at least the time we have today. But perhaps you have some closing remarks you'd like to make to the audience here. We've got, just so people know, we've got obviously representation from Russia with the Russian consulate. We have some, I think, Japanese guests, people from China, and so we've got quite an international crowd of people here, including many Americans.
No, I just want to really, you know, tell you how important it is what you are doing, because you know what I said in the beginning about the immediacy of the war danger is really what should fill your heart and mind with the biggest concern. And I can only ask you, stay tuned every day, follow these developments every day and make them to cause you to act on it. Mobilize your congressman, your city council, your mayor, get active, because this is a moment of utmost crisis. But if you mobilize in the right way, that crisis can be turned into a completely new paradigm. I'm absolutely optimistic, and you know, there's really nothing to lose and everything to be gained.